Next, we're going to talk about Porter's 5 competitive forces. This is the industry analysis component of the course. I have a view that this is only one way to look at business, but Porter is certainly one of the most recognized figures in strategy, and his approach is one that you need to factor into your analysis and certainly need to factor into your case analyses, but it's only one of a range of ways of looking at strategy. Simply put, Porter focuses on the industry in which you do business. An industry is a group of firms producing products that are close substitutes for one another. So an industry can be, food of a certain type, perhaps junk food industry. There could be beverage industry. There could be even in financial services, which is an industry I'm part of. My company is part of the financial services industry because we cover a range of financial services, including insurance, mutual funds, institutional asset management. But each of those is also an industry. So to the extent that we do life insurance, that's not necessarily directly in the same industry as mutual funds. So MassMutual is life insurance. Oppenheimer Funds, which is a subsidiary of MassMutual, is retail mutual funds. The two of them collectively are part of financial services, but individually each of them is in a different industry. One is in retail mutual funds, one is in life insurance and related products. So those are where the products are close enough to substitute one for the other. Industry competition is a function, according to Porter, of 5 forces of competition: the threat of new entrants, bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of buyers, the threat for substitute products, and rivalry among competing firms. Let's talk a little bit about the threat of a new entrant. Basically, to the extent that there are extensive barriers to entry, so it's very difficult for a third party to get into your market, this threat is substantially mitigated. So, to the extent that you need substantial economies of scale, that is, you need to be big enough to be able to tap into a market, my apologies, then without size you can't compete, then size becomes an advantage. Product differentiation: if you have an incredibly unique product that's very hard to reproduce, then it's going to be very difficult for others to enter that market. Not that they won't try. You just have to look at the iPad, which clearly is a dominant player from Apple's perspective today, and yet iPad, by definition, is beginning to face competition from other tablet products in the marketplace. So even a unique product can face competition. The question is how unique is it in terms of its competitive advantage. Capital requirements can be another barrier for new entrants to get in. If it is extraordinarily expensive to make the investment to get into a particular market, then it's unlikely that new entrants will want to go in unless they can be reasonably confident that they can generate very good returns for that capital. Switching costs: if it's very expensive for your customers to switch from one product to another, for example, it is often very difficult and very expensive to switch from one communications provider to another for large companies because they have significant technology investment already in those in the communication solutions they're using. To the extent that those switching costs are high, that can provide a barrier to competition from outside. Access to distribution channels: if you have the most robust direct access to the customer, wherever that customer is, then certainly it's hard for competitors to come in and be competitive if they don't have the same direct access to those consumers. And finally, government policy. If you have, for example, a government-imposed monopoly for one reason or another, or you have a restriction that's provided by government on others competing with you, then you have a barrier to entry. Probably the best example of that is a patent. for a period of time, when you've developed a new technology, which in itself is product differentiation, you also can get a patent on that product. That patent, by definition, limits competitors' ability to duplicate that product for a period of time. And during that period of time, it's an automatic barrier for your competitors to enter that space. The other concern that comes up in terms of these types of barriers to entry is that you should always expect that your competitors will react, and you should expect some form of retaliation. So, for example, to the extent that you have a patent, they may challenge that patent, or they may try to reverse engineer so that they don't breach the patent, but they're able to develop a competitive product that just operates under a different set of principles. So you shouldn't assume that these barriers to entry are permanent. You shouldn't assume that they're not that they're impossible to remove. But to the extent that you have stronger, higher barriers, certainly that becomes a way to mitigate the threat of new entrants into your market. Another element that influences your industry and your competitive forces is the bargaining power of suppliers. A supplier group dominated by a few large companies is going to be able to control the pricing of the supplies you need to manufacture your product. It may be impossible for you to get substitutes for the product. Supplier goods are critical to your process, so if a particular supplier has the only available resources, and a good example of this is Chile as a country is the single largest supplier of copper in the world. Copper has become perhaps the single most important, or one of the most important resources, as it is an element of almost every piece of technology. So Chile has become a much stronger economy as the Chinese, North Americans, and Europeans and other Asian manufacturers have become more and more dependent on Chilean copper. To the extent, just in the same way that if it's expensive for your customer to switch, if it's expensive for you to switch, then this increases the bargaining power of your supplier. And to the extent that your supplier could integrate forward into your industry, in other words, if I'm already manufacturing 9/10 of what it is you sell, perhaps I don't even want you in the market. I'll just go out ahead of you, build the product, sell it to the end customer, and move you out of the market entirely. Disintermediation is what that's called. It's basically pulling you out of that space. Bargaining power of buyers can also influence your relative competitiveness in an industry. If you have a single buyer who produces a large portion of a particular industry output, that buyer has huge negotiating power. If the product that you sell is a significant portion of your revenue, then you're putting yourself at risk that if for whatever reason that product is no longer needed, then your ability to negotiate with buyers will be significantly negatively impacted. If there are low switching costs, if your customers can go from you over to another customer, so to the extent that what you sell is a commodity that's available through multiple locations, then it's unlikely that you're going to have significant power to bargain with your buyers. For example, if there are 5 gas stations within a mile of one another, it's almost impossible for me to charge in any more than a few cents, and perhaps even a cent or two more than my competitors at the other gas stations, because it's very easy for you to look at the signs in the 5 gas stations and say, gas station 1 is the cheapest one to go to, so I'm going to switch over there. Even though I normally pull into gas station 2, I'm going to gas station 1 because it only means I have to turn right rather than turn left. That's a low switching cost. Again, as I said, undifferentiated or standardized, commoditized products will, by definition, make it impossible for you to have any real way to differentiate. That also applies to the gas stations. In addition to that, if there is a legitimate threat of substitute products for whatever it is that you offer, alternate products outside the industry, for example, email has become a substitute for traditional mail. That's why the U.S. Postal Service is in significant distress. Fewer and fewer people are using traditional snail mail, and email, which is not in the same industry. It's an electronic solution that has become a substitute for the traditional form of mail. The intensity of rivalry among competitors can also influence your business. If you've got a bunch of competitors that are all have relatively equal strength, it's very difficult for any one to differentiate, because they all will be playing against one another. To the extent that you're in an industry that isn't growing very rapidly, I happen to be part of an industry where insurance in general is not growing particularly quickly. We as a company, MassMutual, have been very successful at outpacing industry growth, and that's a good thing. But to the extent that we are staying on par with industry growth, then it's very difficult for us to be especially competitive in a slow growth industry. To the extent that you have high fixed or other costs like storage costs that make it impossible for you to really get price advantages and efficiencies in terms of expenses, that can also limit your ability to be competitive amongst industries. And again, we've talked about switching costs and lack of differentiation. I won't go through that again. High strategic stakes. This refers really to a business that is so critical to a particular competitor that they will fight more aggressively than you might ordinarily expect, and that can create a greater intensity amongst rivals. High exit barriers, again, to the extent that it's tough for a competitor to leave that industry, they're not going to give up their piece of it. For an update on the 5 competitive forces, please see the Harvard Business Publishing interview with Michael Porter that I've posted in BStrat 450 Network. You might as well hear the original guy talking about these 5 forces and some of his thoughts. In effect, this is like having a guest lecturer. It's available both in BStrat 450 Network and in the BStrat 450 channel on YouTube. The link to the original Harvard Business YouTube site is also here, but it's probably easiest for you to just go through one of our sites.